drucht catcher trek. McKay like trow and the dun good tree. The vorna knick is him again. Shame on leg Magilamar. Shame on haze Gilamar. Swing my shame for a sleep. Oh,
Apologies a Carja Fáilteoireamh tonight for the annual Bobby Sands Memorial Lecture. Our comrades in the Colin host this lecture every year to remember Twinbrook's most honoured son, volunteer Bobby Sands, who died on the 5th of May 1981, 39 years ago. The Colin area in West Belfast is connected so intrinsically with Bobby, and we are privileged to honour his memory with you all here tonight. This year, our island is in lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic, and it's been a very difficult time, especially for all of those who are shielding and isolated. This lecture is being delivered on social media platforms to reach into the homes of those who would normally join us from Belfast and beyond, because we know that just because the physical environment has changed, our memories have not, and nor has the importance of remembering our heroes and fallen comrades. I know from my own experience, the term lockdown until now has meant something very different for all of those men and women who were imprisoned as a result of our struggle for Irish freedom. The term would have meant a very different form of isolation without any shielding from the brutality of a prison system which was designed to break the Republican struggle. I recognise there will be many who will be listening tonight and who will have painful memories of the interrogation centres and the prisons, and these anniversaries bring much of those back. I want to say your experience is not forgotten, it is always valued, and I spend every day working with my colleagues to ensure that this period of our struggle always remembers that it is built on sacrifice and loss which can't be measured. Bobby Sands, like so many men and women in our community, was an ordinary person who, as a result of British oppression, went on to do extraordinary things and leave an extraordinary legacy. April the 9th, 1981 was one of the most defining days in Irish electoral history. It was the day that Bobby Sands, this ordinary son of Rathcoole and Twinbrook, was elected MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone from his hospital bed. Elected by ordinary men and women who were moved by his and his comrades' struggle against criminalisation in the torture chambers of the H-blocks. Bobby was the first of the 10 hunger strikers to give their lives in the summer of 1981. I was not yet born, and still I feel such a connection to his place in the centuries-old struggle for Irish freedom in Britain's first and nearest colony. Bobby and 9 of his comrades laid down their lives in a selfless act of heroism that has inspired millions across the world and continues to inspire generations to come. The legacy of these and the legacy of all of our Patriot dead is the inspiration that they have left behind. It is the pride that fills our hearts and our minds as we think of them. It is the passion for Irish freedom that we share with them, and it lives and breathes on through our younger generations today. It is the rhythm of time. For me, Bobby Sands and all of our Patriot dead are not just names from history books, our faces that look down on us from murals, our names on a roll of honour. Their spirit is with us as proud Irish Republicans every single day. We continue to be guided by them in all that we do, and our motivations for Irish freedom are separated only by time. Three of West Belfast's proudest sons were Bobby Sands, Kieran Doherty and Joe McDonnell. I was born in May 1988, 7 years after their deaths, and their memory has always been a huge inspiration to me. In their time, the political prisoners set the agenda, and we have shown our ability as a party year on year to set the political agenda. Just as Bobby Sands and his comrades have inspired us for a generation, we will continue to draw on their idealism, commitment and dedication, and do all that we can to realise their vision of an Ireland free from oppression, where all of our citizens are treated equally and with dignity, where all of our children are cherished, an Ireland of which Bobby Sands and all of the hunger strikers would justly be proud. So welcome again for anyone who is just joining us online. I am now going to introduce the first of our two speakers for the night. I would now like to introduce a man who makes me so proud to be a Republican, a native of Rathcoole, just like Bobby Sands, then of Short Strand, then held at Her Majesty's pleasure, then Twinbrook, and he recently emigrated to Andersonstown. So yes, the person I am introducing is none other than Jim Gibney. Jim is a giant of modern republicanism. He is an activist whose life is a lived example of Bobby Sands saying that no job is too great or too small in the pursuit of Irish freedom. Jim's entire adult life has been dedicated to Republican values. He has been at the heart of the political progress of Sinn Féin in the modern era. A man with no ego, and I know he'll be horrified to hear me speaking of him in such glowing terms, but none of us who know him will allow him to write himself out of the contribution that he has made to our struggle for peace and independence. Jim has been a constant in the Republican struggle, a life dedicated to his people and to his community, and he has been part of the development of initiatives and strategies that resulted in bringing the British government to the negotiating table and building our fragile peace. The greatness of a man is not in how much wealth he acquires, but in his integrity and ability to affect others around him positively. And Jim is therefore a very rich man indeed. It is my great pleasure to introduce this unbowed and unbroken Republican, Jim Gibney.
Wow, that was some introduction, and to say the least, it's very difficult to follow it. But I do appreciate the very kind words, Orlia. Thank you very much for those very generous and kind words. And just before I begin to talk about that watershed period in our history, both politically and personally, just a few things I would like to say by way of context, and particularly by way of helping young Republicans or young people who are interested in the hunger strike period and the prison protests in Armagh Women's Prison and in the H blocks. There are a small number of books which I think are very worthwhile reading. 10 Men Dead by David Beresford, Nothing But an Unfinished Song by Dennis O'Hearn, Nor Meekly Serve My Time by Brian Campbell and Lawrence McKeown. Lawrence was on the second hunger strike. and survived 73 days on it. And a film called Hunger by Steve McQueen. And that film in particular presents the scale of the inhumanity and brutality of the prison warders and the prison administration in the H blocks for 5 years. And there are some people who I think, while we talk about the hunger strike period and prison protests, that we need to think of tonight as well. Michael Gaughan, who died in Park House Prison in 1974 in hunger strike. He was 24 years of age. Frank Stagg, who died in Wakefield Prison in hunger strike in 1976, and Frank was 36 years of age. And Mairead Farrell, who was on the first hunger strike in Armagh Women's Prison, and was shot dead in March 1988 with Dan McCann and Sean Savage in Gibraltar by the SAS. Sean McKenna, who died of natural causes but was on the first hunger strike and was gravely ill, and who never regained his full health. And Pat McGowan, who was on the second hunger strike and who was known as the 11th hunger striker. Now, I kind of want to deal in generalities about this particular period in our history. And I suppose, if you like, if there was a comparable period to it, it's the executions of the leaders of the 1916 Rising. And what happened in the H blocks and what happened to the leaders of the Rising, I think, bear up in terms of the bravery of each of the individuals involved, facing the death squad, the British Army death squads in Kilmainham jail and in the prison hospital, as each of the prisoners themselves crossed the threshold between life and death. And similarly with Michael Gaughan and Frank Stagg, in their circumstances, in very lonely circumstances they were when they died on hunger strike. The other thing I think I would like to say is that people died not just in the prison, but they also died here on the streets. In that fateful year, that fateful summer of 1981, 60 people died, 60 people lost their lives in the north and in Britain as a consequence of the hunger strike. And there's another group of people, two groups of people who I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to, and that is the families of the hunger strikers, their parents in particular, and the people on the streets who never give up and marched the length and breadth of Ireland in support of the prisoners. And it was a national movement, a popular national movement on the streets in support of the prisoners. So the people never let the prisoners down, and the prisoners never let the people down. So what came out of that period, I think, just like the executions of the leaders of 1916, so much change happened in the struggle for independence and a united Ireland. And I think primarily the protest movement, which was national, brought it home to everybody that the struggle for Irish independence could not be won within the confines of the 6 counties. That it had to be set in a wider frame, and in a wider frame that meant the island, the nation, and the people of the nation. The Republican and national ideal which is very strong to this day in the south of the island, was as strong then as well. The other thing that came out of the hunger strike, of course, was the election interventions or the election strategy of Sinn Féin. And that came out of the election result in Fermanagh South Tyrone when Bobby Sands won the seat. But there were other elections before Bobby's which indicated popular support for the prisoners. 50 councillors were elected in the local government elections of that year, and standing on a pro-support ticket for the prisoners. And Raymond McCreasy's father was elected as a councillor in Camlock as well. And of course, two TDs were elected, Kieran Doherty and Paddy Agnew in Louth, and Kevin Monaghan. And a number of prisoners and hunger strikers received very impressive votes in the election that returned Kieran Doherty and Paddy Agnew across the southern state. So I think that if you want to understand the modern growth of Sinn Féin, it's to be found in 1981, in the elections of 1981. And Owen Carron, who was Bobby Sands' election agent, he, in a by-election that followed Bobby's death, won the Fermanagh South Tyrone seat with a bigger majority than Bobby had. So the hunger strike itself had all sorts of political significance, and there were seismic shifts in the struggle. And I think as well, I remember the historian, essayist, narrator, and novelist Ulick O'Connor, who died just last year, 91 years of age. And I remember him at Fela many, many years ago saying, when he was speaking about the hunger strike, that in the annals of world history and in the annals of Irish history, there was never a period like the period where 10 men died on hunger strike. And Ulick spoke about the love the hunger strikers had for their comrades in the prison, the love that their parents had for them, and the bond that there was between the people and the prisoners. So it was an incredible period in our history, and it's very important that we never forget that period, and that we continually look to that period, as Arlia said, for the inspiration that many people draw from it to this day, 39 years ago. And I'd just like to conclude by commending everyone involved in putting tonight's event together to give us the opportunity to reflect on that period and the lessons that have come out of it for the continuation of the struggle for freedom and independence.
Really appreciate you sharing some of your own experiences with us in relation to that period. And I'm sure that all the viewers online who are watching with us agree that it's a privilege to hear those reflections from yourself. So, Gormila Mayagov. Akarja, we are now going to move on to our second speaker for tonight. And once again, it is my great pleasure to introduce Paul Donnelly to say a few words. Paul Donnelly, TD, was elected to Leinster House this February, topping the poll in Leo Varaga's constituency of Dublin West. Paul, too, is a lifelong Republican, from his activism on the streets of inner city Dublin to delivering unfo-blocked Republican news to the north at a very, very dangerous time. Paul has lived his entire life trying to break partition, never allowing partitionism to even permeate the hill where he proudly supports the Dubs through thick and thin. When it was deeply unpopular to defend republicanism in the south, Paul fought the censorship and the marginalisation of our struggle. Paul is a youth and community worker by trade which will surprise no one who is in his company for more than 5 minutes. He and his family live the Republican values of cherishing all of the children of the nation equally. He's fought for a long, long time to get Sinn Féin a seat in Dublin West. And as one of the very first seats declared in the recent elections, everyone cheered loudly, seeing such hard work rewarded. So it is my great pleasure to ask Paul to say a few words for Amelia. Paul.
All right, it's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening, and it's really a pleasure to hear Jim, and I know Jim a very, very long time, and it's extremely humbling to hear, from Jim the struggle of people in the north, and I suppose what I'd like to talk about this evening is just in terms of the context of looking at it from Dublin, and how that impacted on us as young people in Dublin, and how we responded to it. I was very, very young at the time during the hunger strikes, but I vividly remember every single episode of that. I think Jim made a very good point in relation to 1916, to the Easter Rising. And we went through Christian Brothers schools, and, Irish history, Irish nationalism, Gaelic games would have been very, very important in those schools. So we would have grown up with a very, very strong sense of 1916, of the War of Independence, of the fight for Irish freedom. However, there was a disconnect then. We didn't hear very much about what was happening in the north, in terms from say late 1960s right up even to we were in school. And bear in mind, it's very difficult, I suppose, for if young people are looking in here, to really understand censorship and really understand the impact that had on people in the South, and how the media had complete control. We didn't have social media. We didn't have Skype. We didn't have mobile phones. We relied on newspapers, and we relied primarily on RTE. And we had massive, heavy censorship of the narrative that was coming from the north. So everything that was coming from a partitionist or from a British perspective if you were watching BBC or UTV. So for us to get our news and our information, it was passed pretty much mouth to mouth or through on Footblocked. And that was probably the only forum and venue that we had to listen or to hear or to read about what was happening in the north. And it's important to put it into that context, because primarily the Irish state, the 26 counties, was only interested in protecting its own power. It was only interested in protecting itself. And they saw the struggle in the north as something that was a threat to them. And that was, I suppose, it's important when you put it into the context of the hunger strikes, because what that did was, and what Bobby Sands did was, he broke through that. He broke through that barrier to a generation who really didn't hear or understand unless you were, unless you were going to search it out. You didn't hear it on the radio and television about what was going on, except bombs, killings, all of those different things, condemnations, day in, day out. We never heard the narrative of what it was, what was it about. So I think the importance of 1981 in terms of sort of electoralism for Sinn Féin, but also in terms of just connecting with that generation of people like me, who had a very, very strong sense of republicanism, had a very strong sense of a united Ireland, but never really connected at that stage with the struggle in the north. And I suppose I remember really distinctly going to school. I lived in a place called East Wall, which is in the north inner city. It's on the outskirts of the inner city, and I remember going to school, and there's a road called the North Strand near the Five Lamps, and there's about 6 or 7 flat complexes on either side of the road, and every day we would see black flags. More and more black flags would be put out the windows, put on the poles. In our area in East Wall, pretty much every flagpole where the bus would go through, the entire length would be black flags. And that raised an awareness for us in terms of the impact that it was having on our generation. in the 26 counties and in Dublin in particular. And I remember distinctly, for us as a Dublin family, and I think it's important to put it into that context. My family weren't Republican. They weren't from a staunch Republican family. They were probably more likely Labour supporters. And they were more fearful in terms of involvement with the Republican struggle because, the first thing that would happen is if you were at a march or if you were at a meeting, the first thing that would happen is special branch would take your name. The next thing would happen, probably pretty much the following day, would be that they'd knock on your door and tell your parents that you were associating with known members of the IRA. And that was a tactic that they used very successfully to frighten people, frighten families, frighten Republicans, and frighten people away from the movement. So I know often when I've travelled up the north, and I always got a sense of when I was in, whether it be Belfast or Derry or Tyrone or whatever, I got such a strong sense of community, and I always wished I lived in a strong Republican area whereby you're out there and you were proud of who you are and what you were. Whereas in Dublin, it was very, very much a struggle. It was a struggle to be who you were because if you declared yourself as a Republican, you lost a job. You were harassed. You were pretty much ostracized in pretty much everywhere you go because the sense of that censorship had took such a strong control. And the importance of the hunger strikes and the importance of Bobby Sands was that it broke through all of that. And it created that generation, which was the 1916 generation. And I look at the two seminal moments in Irish history, and one is 1916, and the other one absolutely is the 81 hunger strikes, where a whole generation of young people in the South and in Dublin were politicised. And so many of us can trace our republicanism back to that moment. That horrific moment when we heard that Bobby Sands had passed away. And that next day there was a sense of real hurt, real upset, and real anger as over what had happened. And, I think that sort of sense of justice, that sense of wanting to really finish what Bobby Sands and all of your hunger strikers and all of the volunteers and everybody who has campaigned for United Ireland, that still is there in your heart when you reflect those moments of difficulty, of strife, of just times when you're really struggling to keep it going. You reflect back and you think that's what it's about, and that's what the hunger strikes and that's what Bobby Sands really sort of brings to the core in me and what keeps me going.
Paul, again, listen, thanks very much. It's just fascinating listening to both you and Jim and your different experiences. And just even when both of you were speaking and referencing around the election of Bobby Sands as an MP and Kieran Doherty and Paddy Agnew as TDs. And, it's clear that Sinn Féin is now the story north and south of this island, and the scale of the recent election results that we've had right across the island is just the signs of the fundamental change that we're heading into on the road to a new and independent Ireland, which is obviously a huge credit to the hunger strikers and to all of our patriot dead. So that maybe leads us in, if you're happy enough, maybe to take just a few questions, if that's okay. Sure. So the first question, I'll ask the first question to Jim, if that's okay, Jim. And just as we're discussing the hunger strike tonight in the context of a hugely contested debate on dealing with the past and British bad faith, do the two discussions collide or are they siloed in your view, Jim?
Well, I think the whole question of legacy is intrinsically linked to what we're dealing with in terms of resolving the injustices of partition. and the injustice of British involvement in our country. So the two things are very closely entwined in terms of resolving the issues that arise out of partition and that arise out of the conflict itself. And at the heart of the legacy issue is the reality of what the British government did in this country, in the northern part of this country. Formerly through their armed forces, the killing of people on these streets throughout the war years, and then insidiously through the use of loyalist organisations to kill somewhere in the region of 1,000 Catholic people. So the legacy is not about revenge, it's about truth. And it's about service, a justice for the families of those and the relatives of those who died in the conflict. And the reality also is that this very important community, this very important constituency of people, in real terms, are the only group of people who have not benefited significantly from the peace process itself. And for them to benefit fully, which is what they're entitled to, because you have to remember we are dealing with people who lost loved ones, and what they're entitled to is the truth. And unless they get the truth, then the peace process, there is a huge gap.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jim, thanks very much.
And congratulate Paul. If I could I just wanted to congratulate Paul and his team in electing Paul to the Dáil. I know myself through Andre the struggle that Paul and his team have been involved in for quite a long number of years. So it was a tremendous victory, Paul. Congratulations and well done. Mm-hmm. And I know that went down very well in your own community and across Dublin. But I thought your contribution just now about what life was like for young Republicans and what it was like to live in a partition state that disowned its history and buried its history and repressed its people, like yourself as a young man and others. It was fascinating to listen to it. And the good news is that you and others like you, determined to stayed the pace, and now you've turned the situation around. And Sinn Féin is the largest party in the South with 37 TDs, and I would be very confident that in the fullness of time, Sinn Féin will be in government, and Mary Lou Taoiseach. So congratulations.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. And Paul, we'll maybe just move on to the next, and we'll make this maybe just the final question for tonight's session. But I would just like to ask, where do you see the debate on Irish unity today, and what is influencing that?
I think the debate around Irish unity has never been stronger. I think the desire for Irish unity has never been stronger. In my lifetime, absolutely. I think the freedom we have now to be able to debate it, to be able to talk about it, to be able to campaign for it, is as strong as it's ever been. And I think that's reflected obviously in the vote that we're getting. And I think there are a number of reasons as to why we got such a large vote at the last election. Irish unity is absolutely one of those. And I think there will be a push and there will be a drive by the partitionists within this state, and you can see it already, where they are trying to sort of sideline the whole issue around Irish unity. And they're trying to put it aside and say, it's not really about that. Sinn Féin's, and if you listen to the conversations that were had over the period of maybe 2 to 3 days of the count itself and commentating afterwards, it was very much around, this is the politics, it's around social justice, it's around jobs and housing and health and all of that. And they completely and utterly ignored Irish unity. And it is impossible to say that, you know, the entirety of the vote is all about that and it's not about Irish unity, because that's who we are. That's the part. We are the party, you know, of Irish unity, and people accept that, and that's why they voted in huge numbers for Sinn Féin alongside the other issues. So I think we need to have a confidence in ourselves to say, you know, let's now drive this forward. Let's come up with a strategy. Let's move that strategy forward about how we drive that forward in terms of gaining more political support, because that's what it will be about, gaining more political support in terms of the Dáil. But we also have to not get sucked into the institution of the Dáil and make sure that we're rooted, we're grounded in our communities, and that we continue that dialogue with people on the ground so that we strengthen. So whoever voted for us in relation to housing or health or education or whatever it may be, that we include Irish unity as part of that conversation with them as well, so that we educate them. And that's how we build that political movement that will drive that strategy for United Ireland. And I think we are in an incredibly strong position at the moment to do that.
Okay, Paul, thanks very much. And no better way to end off tonight's session, as we've all faced the republicanism is in an extremely good place right across the island. And of course, all our thanks and honour have to go to all of our patriot dead and all those who lost their lives on the hunger strike. If it wasn't for their sacrifice, we wouldn't be where we are today. So, folks, I would just like to conclude on tonight's session, and I think a special thanks must go to our two speakers, Jim Gibney and Paul Donnelly, who have took the time to contribute and to speak very vividly of their own personal stories. And I believe that I speak for us all when I say that they have made our first online annual lecture, streaming live into your homes, very special this year. Of course, I'd also like to thank everyone who's tuned in to watch online with us, particularly a special thanks to any of the family members of our patriot dead who are watching. We missed you all this year at Easter, and I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed tonight's discussion as much as I have. Here's hoping that next year we can come together and make next year's Bobby Sands Memorial Lecture even bigger and better in honour of our heroes. So take care, Akarja, and Slán go fóill.